Joining me in the Catalyst studio today is Chris King, who is running for governor.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we just are out of the Tiger Bay, and I thought it was fantastic. I thought it's exactly what Tiger Bay was meant to do. You had a really candid conversation. You had some great questions, and it was a great environment where a lot of knowledge went back and forth. And how was your experience there?
I enjoyed it. I used it as a little different opportunity than just doing another stump speech. I've given probably 250 stump speeches, but as we're 22 days from the election, this is sort of the moment where you're wanting to talk about some of the most powerful ideas that you have, and you're trying to make a difference. And so today I really talked about, in my view, I talked about faith. I talked about faith in politics. I talked about race. Talked about what happened here in Clearwater with Marquise McLaughlin and Stand Your Ground, and took on some pretty tough issues today.
Yes, you did. When you introduced the idea of your faith, you mentioned an experience you had at camp, and you just mentioned it briefly. I'd like to dig into that a little more. Can you talk about that, what that meant to you and what that was?
I shared today that, my view is that there is this really dangerous strand of white evangelical conservatism that is going on in the nation. And it was manifested just a week ago here in Tampa at the big Trump rally that has sort of co-opted faith or people of faith, and I think taken it in the wrong direction. And so I was sharing that I believe we as Democrats, that like me, I'm a Christian, have an opportunity to talk about what it might look like in our politics and what's an alternative vision. And so I shared, to your question, my initial inspiration for me was when I was a 15-year-old high school freshman going into my sophomore year. I went to a summer camp up in St. Simons, Georgia, a Methodist retreat center, and just had one of those experiences that sometimes, you have early in your life that kind of changed the direction of my life. And I felt as if the Lord and faith was going to play a central part. And that's really where a lot of my values come from.
So moving on from that to where you are now, when did it start to come on your radar that this, as you call it, hijacking happened? And how did that sort of start to present itself to you? And then how did your ideas about that refine?
I went to college. I did my undergrad at Harvard. And I think it was pretty early in my time there where I just recognized that there was this tremendous skepticism and hurt across the country towards organized religion, and particularly Christians or Christians in politics. And I became more aware of forces, particularly as parts of things like the Moral Majority or Christian Coalition in the 80s and 90s, that really changed politics as we know it. Trump today is, to me, an even more weaponized version of using faith for political expediency. But that's where it really started. And I became more aware that people, were sometimes skeptical of folks from a faith background. And I had more of a burden or challenge to share why it was a good part of who I was, and it could be a good part for them.
And do you think the counter to that on the other side may be the anti-intellectual movement? Do you see those as sort of being opposite sides of the same sort of move to disenfranchise people?
What I said today at the Tiger Bay was that I feel as if we've just ceded total ground. It is uncomfortable in the public square to talk about faith. It clearly can offend, and there are people who have been hurt. And what I've tried to suggest is that I'm somebody different. I mean, I have a real progressive view of politics, and my Christian faith has actually taken me towards positions. For instance, my acceptance of, support, and care for the LGBT community is directly rooted to my faith tradition, not exactly typical in some communities. And so to me, I have a burden or responsibility of explaining how those values, what they look like. But it's a real central part of me, and I think it's important sometimes for voters. I rarely talk about it, but I've been asked constantly. And this was really an opportunity today to do it.
Another topic you're very passionate about is race, and specifically injustices that can be tied to race. You shared some pretty stark statistics about the impact of race on incarceration and things of that nature. Can you talk about your personal journey with race and how that's led you to be such a champion for improving some of the statistics that you shared today?
Yeah, racial justice, racial reconciliation is probably my area of greatest passion. When I'm making speeches or out in communities, it's probably where people see the most fiery or passionate, enthusiastic Chris. And it's always been that way. I think I got a lot of that from my parents, but it stemmed, I think, really from when I was 12, 13 years old. I was a good basketball player, and I began playing on these things they call AAU teams, where you go all over the state and all over the country playing basketball. And it was the way I was trying to get better and better and better. I was a tall kid. I was a good shooter, but they put me on a team that when I was 12 years old, where I was the only white player on that team. And so for the better part of 2 years, I went all over the country with a group of what became friends and family, but all African American families. And I got such a just, I think, unique education to building friendships across race and some of the challenges. And I'll never forget, it was something I actually wrote my essay to Harvard about this. In those years, folks will remember the Rodney King tragedy. And the night after Rodney King was beaten, we were in a basketball tournament in a very African American part of Central Florida. And I'll never forget that the players and the families called my family the morning of that tournament, the day after this all occurred. And racial tensions across the country were rampant. People were angry. People were mad. And they said to my parents, I don't think you should come tonight. You'll be the only white faces there. We just got to let everything cool down a little bit. And my parents apparently thought about it and made the decision, no, this is just the right moment to come and be there. And so we went. And I talked about the fact that sort of in building community, healthy community, I arrived at this gym, Wymore. I still remember the gym. It was the hottest gym. We were the only white faces. It was packed. And, it just so happened that, Kevin Lewis's father was out smoking a cigarette right where we parked. And then Johnny White's mother just happened to be right there when we pulled up. And, Petey Spinks' family just came right out at just the right time. And what occurred was the families gathered around my family and sat all around them in the gym. And then the players did the same thing for me. And it was just such a simple, but for me, profound act of love and care and concern and how we can come together. And I think that's the voice I've tried to do in this race. Just yesterday was probably the highlight of my campaign thus far. And it was totally unexpected. It occurred, but I've taken a real leading voice in this situation here in Clearwater with Marquise McLaughlin, who was a young African-American, 28-year-old, the father of three, who was gunned down a couple of weeks ago, unarmed with his children, and nobody's been arrested. And for me, I've really talked about, I think in a powerful way, why I believe justice would have looked differently here had Marquise been white, had Marquise been me, because I have three children. I have two boys. I have one girl, just as he did. And I think that's something people don't normally hear, particularly from a white leader.
So when you think about bringing people together and solving some of these problems, the example that you gave, which is very poignant and wonderful, was what I would call bottom-up action, right? It's the community, it's people who knew you, and, humans were humans, right? It's just what will happen, I think, to humans left to their own devices. So understanding that healing these sorts of wounds has to come from a bottom-up. What's your philosophy on legislating that?
Well, I would agree. I mean, I think real and transformational change occurs from relationships, real, authentic relationships. And, even as I've run for governor, that's been my desire, whether it's meeting with the African-American community or a church, whether it's the Muslim community, the LGBT community. I've tried to be a leader who's building real relationships. In other words, I say, my guarantee, I can't guarantee I'll win this election or I'll get this law passed. Nobody can do that. But I want to make a guarantee that I'm going to wear well with you over time. You're going to hopefully like me more the second time, the third time, the fourth time, because I'm really going to care. And I'm really going to try to listen, hear, and do my very best to honor what you're telling me. And I think that's unique and different. And, I think that's what also has been different about our campaign is so many times when you run for high office, the calculus is what do we need to do to win, to get the exact number of votes we need to pull this off. And for us, it's been what do we need to do to be transformative? And then hopefully we will win and be able to be transformative. So I have taken positions on issues that might not help me politically, but I'm convinced will help the state of Florida from a justice and goodness standpoint. And that set me apart, I think, in this race.
So coming from a place like Harvard, where it's a meritocracy, where everybody's operating at a relatively high level, having to come into an arena which just is obviously beset with bureaucracy, and even doing things like, you were very proud of your family, but you have to position your family as, hey, I fit this mold. I'm a good family person. I'm 16 years. And as if the counter to that means you can't be a good governor, right? So, the idea of having to funnel all this brain power that you have and all these ideals into this process of, and this is your first time in politics question, right? How do you do that? How do you stay sane when you have to do that?
Well, it's certainly very hard. And the only people who really, I think, identify and understand it truly are the candidates I'm running up against. And I can see it in their eyes and they can see it in my eyes. This is a massive state. I've been to goodness, 45, 50 counties, spoken hundreds and hundreds of times, sat for interviews like this, more than I could count. And it's a day in and day out grind, but we do it because we believe that the issues matter. And you sometimes get these glimpses, like where you really feel like your voice has the opportunity. And yesterday, at Marquise McLaughlin's service, I had spoken out pretty boldly on this early, pretty close to this occurring. And I think I'd gotten the attention of the family. And so they or their pastors had invited me to his memorial service, which was last Saturday, about a week ago. And I went and observed and spent time just really letting it sink in. And then they asked me to come and speak at this service with faith leaders, Al Sharpton, all these national figures. And I got the opportunity to speak right before Al Sharpton spoke. And it was just such a wonderful opportunity, I think, for me to speak right to the family and to try to really acknowledge their suffering, but also to acknowledge the racial anger and fear that they have from this, with Marquise's younger son looking right at me. And those are those real, authentic moments that long past the election is over, I will remember. I think they will remember. And you hope that you made an impact.
Along the lines of authenticity, obviously you're not a Trump supporter. One thing that Trump has changed the game on is he's opened the door, it seems, to say almost anything, which has had its drawbacks. Yet at the same time, before that happened, it seemed like there'd been this long stretch where political discourse was all about avoiding the gotcha, saying as little as possible and not getting, caught on camera, not saying deplorables or not saying 47% that, Romney got caught on saying. In the era of Trump, do you feel like you were able to be more authentic, or do you feel like it's maybe the opposite has happened? How has his style of politics changed the political landscape?
Well, certainly a truth is under assault in the current climate. I don't think it's changed the way I act or behave. I mean, right now it would seem as if leaders or politicians who are brash and bullying and can be mean-spirited, are successful and they're winning the day. And perhaps I have a more romantic or idealistic view of politics, but I still believe at the end of the day, what he is doing is artificial. It won't last. It won't create a legacy for him or the people that follow him. It won't bring about meaningful transformational change. And so to me, civility and integrity and honesty have worn well in the past, and they may be out of favor now, but it's what I've been trying to exemplify in this race. And I think most folks in the media and the insiders and who have watched our race have suggested that there is a purity to our candidacy where we have taken positions and where we have led. I mean, we're the newcomer, and yet we have been leading as if we've been doing this for 20 or 30 years in most of the issues. I mean, affordable housing wouldn't be talked about in this race, but for me, I'm the candidate with the economic vision around free community college and trade school. Criminal justice reform, we have put forth the leading package that a lot of my opponents are now supporting parts of. Gun safety, they've said we have the most ambitious proposals to protect our children in the race today. Ideas to me matter. I think it's where I'm strongest. And I think we've changed the Democratic Party for that.
Wonderful. Thank you again for your attendance at Dagger Bay. It was really well done, and good luck in the home stretch.
Thank you very much for having me.